spears, arrows, and cavalry that awaited them. The commander, a figure whose name would echo through history, stood at the prow of the lead boat. Cloaked in a heavy wool mantle, he kept his gaze fixed on the bank ahead, his jaw set like carved stone. His officers had argued for days against this maneuver, warning of the risks. The river was too wide, the current too fast, the enemy too well positioned. One advisor had even suggested that the army wait until summer, when the waters ran lower. But waiting was a luxury he could not afford. The longer they lingered, the stronger the enemy's position became. He needed to strike now, and strike decisively. The stakes were colossal. This was not just about a single battle, it was about the shape of the world to come. On the far side of the river lay a continent rich with resources, cities, and ports, a territory whose control would make his empire unassailable for generations. To the men rowing beside him, it might have been about pay, glory, or simple survival. But to him, this was destiny. Cross the river, and the empire's borders would swell beyond imagination. Fail, and his name would be cursed in every language spoken across the known world. The river itself had always been more than a body of water. For centuries it had been a political boundary, a cultural fault line, and a military barrier. Entire campaigns had collapsed because of it. Tribes along its banks treated it as sacred, a living thing that decided who passed and who perished. Legends told of warriors swallowed whole by its depths, their armor clanging in the darkness below. The current commanders on the opposite bank believed in those stories, and they believed that the river was their ally. But tonight, under the veil of night and mist, the balance was shifting. The soldiers knew the plan in fragments. Engineers had worked in secret, fashioning rafts from felled trees and waterproofed hides. Scouts had mapped the narrowest points and timed the patrol shifts on the opposite shore. The order had gone out to travel light, no baggage, no heavy supplies, only weapons, shields, and the will to fight. Every man carried rations for a single day. If the crossing succeeded, they would seize the enemy's supply lines. If it failed, no amount of food would save them. The commander had chosen his words carefully before they embarked. He did not speak of danger, only of opportunity. The river, he had said, is not our obstacle, it is our gate. And beyond it lies what we have marched for, bled for, and dreamed of. His voice had carried across the campfires, steady and certain. The men had answered with cheers, though in the quiet moments afterward, many stared at the water with unreadable expressions. As the boats slipped into the main current, the mist thickened. From the shore they had left behind, the only sound was the low creak of wood and the distant hoot of an owl. Somewhere ahead, a dog barked, faint but close enough to remind them that the enemy was near. Every man tightened his grip on his oar or spear. The tension was like a drawn bowstring, one wrong move could send an arrow flying. This was the moment where history teetered. In later years, scholars would argue about the decision: was it genius or madness? Did the commander rely on skill, or was he gambling on luck? But in that moment, on that river, such questions were meaningless. There was no turning back. The current had them now, and with it, the fate of nations. By the time the first pale glow of morning began to silver the mist, they were halfway across. The far bank loomed larger with every heartbeat, a dark line bristling with shadows that would soon resolve into the forms of waiting soldiers. Somewhere in that shifting haze of light and fear, the men understood this was not merely a crossing. It was an invasion. It was a challenge. It was the first stroke in the painting of a new world. And as the lead boat's prow scraped against the enemy shore, the river, for centuries a wall, became the road to conquest. To understand why a single river crossing could decide the fate of a continent, we must step back, years before oars touched water, before mist hid the movement of boats, before the commander's name became legend. This river was not chosen at random. It lay at the heart of a vast geopolitical struggle, a frontier where empires met and dreams of expansion crashed against immovable resistance. On one side stood the rising power, young, disciplined, and hungry. Its armies had been tempered by campaigns in the mountains, deserts, and coasts. Its commander, already a figure of myth to his soldiers, had built his reputation on victories against foes thought invincible. To him, the river was the last great barrier before the richest prize in his lifetime, control over a continent whose cities glittered with wealth and whose fertile lands could feed armies for generations. On the opposite bank, the defenders were no strangers to war. Their armies were older, their traditions rooted in centuries of survival against invaders. They understood the land, every bend of the river, every shallow crossing, every high bank perfect for archers. They had no illusions about the intentions of their enemy. To them, the river was not merely a border, it was a line of life and death, the final shield protecting their people, their gods, and their way of life. The political tension had been building for years. Trade disputes turned into skirmishes. Border raids escalated into retaliatory strikes. Envoys sent to negotiate returned with insults instead of agreements. Spies reported that the opposing army was amassing supplies, reinforcing river defenses, and drilling troops in rapid deployment. War, once a possibility, became an inevitability. All that remained was the question of when and where the first blow would fall. The commanders on both sides faced impossible decisions. For the rising empire, a prolonged standoff would drain resources and risk rebellions in newly conquered territories. For the defenders, waiting meant giving the invader time to find a weak point, or worse, to cross at multiple locations simultaneously. The river dictated the tempo of the conflict, and both sides knew that whoever seized the initiative would hold the advantage. But war is never fought on strategy alone. Beneath the movements of armies lay human motives, pride, ambition, revenge, and fear. The invading commander had personal stakes, political rivals at home who questioned his judgment, and a restless army whose loyalty was tied to his ability to deliver victory and plunder. Every delay was an opportunity for enemies in his own court to undermine him. The defenders, too, were bound by pressures beyond the battlefield. Their rulers feared not only defeat but the humiliation of surrender, which could fracture alliances among neighboring states. The landscape itself shaped every decision. The river's breadth and depth varied with the season, its current fed by distant mountain snows. In spring, the waters swelled, drowning fords that had been passable in winter. In summer, the heat baked the banks until the air shimmered, making armor unbearable and exhausting soldiers before they even reached the water's edge. At certain bends, the river cut so deep into the earth that sheer cliffs rose from the shore, natural fortresses impossible to storm without heavy siege equipment. In others, marshes spread for miles, sucking the boots from a man's feet and bogging down cavalry. By the year of the crossing, the river had become more than a geographic obstacle, it had become a psychological one. Every soldier, whether veteran or conscript, carried the weight of the stories told around campfires, of past armies swallowed by its current, of heroes who never returned from its far bank. Crossing it was an act of defiance, not just against the enemy, but against history itself. When the moment came, it would not be decided in the war councils or the royal courts. It would be decided in the minds of thousands of men standing on the shore, staring at the water, and choosing to step in. That choice, to risk everything in the name of victory, was about to reshape the map of the known world. The river was a living wall, wide, swift, and watched. Every soldier on both sides knew it could not be crossed in force without alerting the enemy. That was precisely why the commander's plans seemed, at first, like madness. He did not intend to wait for a ford to dry, or for the enemy to grow complacent. He would take his army across now, in full view of the dangers, using speed and deception as his greatest weapons. From the beginning, the plan relied on secrecy so absolute that even some of his own officers knew only fragments. Under the cover of night, small teams of engineers worked in silence along concealed bends of the river, felling trees for rafts and lashing them together with rawhide. Scouts moved like shadows, charting eddies, measuring depths with weighted lines, and memorizing the positions of enemy watchfires. Their reports were committed to memory, then burned, no written record that could betray them. The commander's genius lay not just in his tactics, but in his understanding of psychology. He knew that the defenders would expect a crossing at the most obvious points, wide, flat banks where horses could be brought ashore easily. He also knew that these points would be the most heavily guarded. Instead, he selected a crossing where the current was strongest, the bank steep, and the approach concealed by a sharp bend. To the enemy, it would seem impossible. That impossibility was the heart of the plan. Timing would be critical. The crossing would begin before dawn, using the thickest part of the river mist as cover. The first wave would consist of the most disciplined infantry, men trained to hold formation even with icy water up to their chests. Their task was to seize a small stretch of shoreline and hold it at all costs until the rest of the army could follow. Behind them, archers and slingers would provide covering fire from boats, driving back any defenders who reached the bank. Yet even with perfect execution, the risks were immense. One broken raft could send dozens to the bottom. One alarm raised too soon could bring enemy reinforcements down in crushing numbers. And if the far bank could not be secured quickly, the army would be caught midstream, half on one side, half on the other, doomed to destruction. Still, the commander refused hesitation. "We do not wait for fortune," he told his officers. "We make her." His voice cut through the murmurs of doubt. Every man present knew that in ancient war, hesitation was as deadly as any spear. Orders spread through the camp in silence. Units packed only what they could carry, leaving behind tents, heavy baggage, and even cooking pots. Fires were extinguished early to keep from drawing attention. By midnight, the first rafts were already in position, tied to trees along the shore, ready to be loosed into the current at the signal. The plan's brilliance was its gamble, to turn the river from the enemy's shield into the invader's weapon. If they succeeded, they would strike the defenders where they least expected, smashing through the first line before the main army could even form. If they failed, the river would claim them, and the continent would remain forever out of reach. The men did not speak of failure. They spoke only of the moment when the oars would bite into the current, and history would shift forever. The signal came not with a shout, but with the low, mournful note of a horn, a sound that seemed to melt into the river mist. Oars dipped as one, cutting into the black water. The current caught the first raft, swinging it broadside, but the rowers dug deep, pulling in perfect rhythm until the prow straightened again. Behind them, more rafts pushed away from the shore, their dark shapes vanishing into the fog. The river was at its fullest, swollen with snowmelt from distant mountains. Its surface was deceptive, calm in some stretches but hiding whirlpools and shifting undercurrents. Spray struck faces like cold needles. Men gritted their teeth not from the enemy's arrows, not yet, but from the numbing bite of the water as it sloshed into the craft and soaked their boots. The wooden hulls groaned against the pressure of the current, every creak sounding louder than it should in the stillness. Halfway across, the enemy saw them. Shouts cut through the fog, followed by the deep, rhythmic thud of war drums from the far bank. Torches flared to life, throwing wild, flickering light across the water. Arrows hissed overhead, the first fell short, vanishing into the current with a hiss, but the next found their mark. A man in the bow jerked backward, an arrow protruding from his shoulder. His comrades pushed him down and kept rowing, their faces set in grim determination. The commander stood in the prow of the lead boat, cloak snapping in the wind, scanning the shoreline. He saw movement, enemy infantry rushing into position, archers scrambling for higher ground, cavalry wheeling into formation just beyond the bank. He barked orders over the roar of the water, his voice carrying even through the chaos, "Forward! Hold your line!" The first wave hit the shallows hard. Men leapt from the rafts into waist-deep water, shields up, splashing toward the bank. The sound was deafening now, arrows striking shields, the crash of waves against the shore, the shouts of both attacker and defender. Mud sucked at their feet as they pushed forward, stumbling but refusing to fall. On the far bank, defenders rained projectiles down from behind makeshift barricades. The invaders' archers, firing from rafts still midstream, sent volleys in return, forcing some defenders to duck behind cover. Slingers hurled stones with bone-cracking force, targeting enemy officers trying to rally their men. The moment of crisis came in the first minutes ashore. The lead units had secured a thin strip of land, barely enough to form a defensive line, but the defenders surged forward, their war cries cutting through the mist. Spears clashed, shields splintered. The water ran red at the edges where men fell back into the shallows. The commander himself waded ashore with the second wave, sword drawn. He was no figurehead, every soldier knew that when he led from the front, morale surged. He struck at the flank, cutting down 2 defenders in quick succession, giving his men the momentum to push forward. Step by bloody step, they gained ground. From the river, more boats arrived, disgorging reinforcements who crashed into the melee. Engineers, working under fire, dragged sections of makeshift barricades into place to protect the landing zone from cavalry charges. Drums still pounded from the enemy rear, but the rhythm was faltering. The defenders were no longer in control of the shoreline. The turning point came when a squad of light infantry, moving through a hidden gully upstream, emerged behind the enemy's left flank. It had been a calculated gamble, sending men on a longer, more dangerous route in hopes of catching the defenders off guard. The effect was immediate. Cut off from retreat and attacked from 2 directions, the defenders' formation buckled. The invaders surged forward with a roar, driving the defenders from the bank. In moments, what had been a desperate fight for a toehold became a full breach. The shoreline was theirs. As the sun broke through the fog, it revealed a scene of exhaustion and triumph. Men stood knee-deep in the water, gasping for breath, their armor dented and dripping. Behind them, the river gleamed like molten silver, its current still swift, its danger still real. But for the first time, the far bank belonged to the invaders. The commander looked upriver, then down, taking in the scale of what they had achieved. The impossible had been done. And with this crossing, the road to the continent lay open. The shoreline was no longer a contested no-man's land, it was a wedge driven deep into the defender's flank. What began as a desperate foothold was expanding by the minute. Fresh units, now pouring across the river, widened the line with each wave. The defenders, once confident in the river as their shield, now found themselves fighting on ground they had never imagined the enemy could reach so swiftly. At first, the defenders tried to rally. Trumpets blared from behind the lines, summoning reserves. Officers barked orders, forming ad hoc ranks to plug the breaches. Cavalry attempted to circle wide, looking for a chance to strike the invaders' exposed sides. But the terrain that had seemed to favor them, the steep banks, the marshy shallows, now worked against rapid maneuver. The shoreline was crowded, and the defenders' own numbers began to choke their movements. The commander seized the moment. Standing at the forward line, mud streaked up his legs, he pointed his sword toward a narrow ridge that ran parallel to the river. "Take it," he ordered, knowing that control of that ridge would lock the defenders into a retreat. A unit of his most experienced infantry surged forward, shields interlocked, advancing under a hail of arrows. Step by step they climbed the slope, their discipline unbroken. From the ridge the effect was devastating. The defenders below could now be targeted from above, their formations shattered by javelins and sling stones. Panic began to ripple through their lines. A shouted order to fall back was misheard by some units as a general retreat. Gaps opened. The invaders poured through them like water breaking a dam. On the defenders' right flank, the upstream detachment that had slipped behind enemy lines struck again, this time aiming for the command tent. Chaos erupted. Messengers ran in every direction, some with orders, others simply fleeing. In that confusion, the defenders' once solid line dissolved into fragments of isolated fights, each man fending for himself. The rout was sudden and complete. Cavalry meant to counterattack instead galloped away to save themselves. Archers abandoned their positions, leaving bundles of unused arrows behind. Infantry units dropped shields to run faster. The shoreline, moments ago a wall of resistance, became a scramble for survival. the commander did not let the momentum slip. He ordered the army to press forward, not giving the enemy a chance to regroup. Pursuit continued for miles inland, cutting down stragglers and seizing supply wagons. By the time the invaders halted to reorganize, they had captured not just ground but the enemy's morale. When the sun stood high, the river behind them was no longer a boundary, it was a bridge. The impossible crossing had not only succeeded, it had shattered the enemy's ability to defend their lands. A continent that had once seemed beyond reach now lay open, its fate tied to the victory won in those few decisive hours. By the time the dust settled and the wounded were carried from the field, the shape of the world had changed. The river, once an unbreakable border, was now a silent witness to a conquest that would ripple through generations. Its currents still ran swift, but now they carried the echoes of oars and the memory of men who had turned its waters from a wall into a road. News of the crossing spread faster than armies could march. In cities far from the battlefield, merchants whispered of new trade routes opening. Kings and chieftains recalculated their alliances. Some sent envoys bearing gifts, hoping to align themselves with the rising power, others began preparing defenses, knowing they might be next. The victory was not just military, it was psychological. It told the world that no river, no mountain, no fortress was beyond reach. For the commander, this was the moment that secured his place in history. Chroniclers would write of him as a man who dared what others feared to attempt, whose boldness redrew the map. In their accounts, the crossing was a clean triumph, a decisive blow of genius. But those who had stood in the boats that morning knew another truth: the cost had been heavy. Friends had been lost midstream, pulled under by the current or struck down before their boots touched the far bank. Victory had come, but it had not come cheaply. The defenders who survived scattered into the countryside. Some would return under new rule, their lands absorbed into the expanding empire. Others would keep fighting in pockets of resistance, determined to reclaim what had been lost. For them, the river would forever be a place of mourning, a reminder of the day their shield failed. Years later, travelers would stand on its banks and point to the spot where the first boats landed. Stories would grow in the telling, of soldiers who walked on water, of enemies frozen in fear, of a commander whose gaze alone could part the mist. Some would believe these tales, others would know that the truth was more complex, more human. And yet, as the sun set on that day, one fact was undeniable: the crossing had won not just a battle, but the keys to a continent. History would remember the victors, but the river, in its endless flow, would remember everyone.